We're ready to reconvene.
Alrighty. Now is the time for general public comments regarding matters not on the agenda. Please state your name.
My name is Dale Guston. I'm usually appearing for City Council and not on the Planning Commission because you meet the same night as the school board, and that's where I've been most of the time. But it's a pleasure to appear before you. Some of you I've known for a long time, and some I haven't. Anyway, you got a big job tonight, even though it's just a discussion item. I understand you can make recommendations to the City Council, even on discussion items. So good luck.
Thank you. Anyone else? Anybody online, Marcy?
No callers.
And with that, I'll close general public comments. Any agenda items proposed to be tabled or rescheduled?
There are none.
And there are no public hearings tonight. And on to discussion items. First, the item for this evening is Comprehensive Zoning Code Update. Review a subset of the proposed revisions to the zoning code, sections within Article 4, regulations and standards applicable to all zones of the Paso Robles zoning code. Presentation by staff, please.
Yes, Mr. Chairman, members of the commission. So this is another item or another section of the zoning code update. You've had various sections before. There's a few more after this, but we're coming to the end. We have our consultant Genevieve online tonight who's going to do a presentation. Katie and I are here as well. Darcy Delgado and Katie have been working really hard with Genevieve and her team to just go through this information, go through the old, go through the new, and try to get it in a form that can be presented to you in this, again, study session. So the idea is that we would go through some different sections, similar to what we've done before, with the goal of this whole update, rewrite coming back to the Planning Commission for the official public hearing, requesting at that time the recommendation to the City Council. And I think we have some timelines, and Katie and Genevieve can fill you in on kind of where we are in that and how long until we think we're going to get to the Planning Commission. So appreciate you hanging in there on this. I know it's a long process. I know some of the folks in the public have been waiting a long time for these sections to come through as well. So I'm real hopeful, and I know it's going to be a better document and a better user-friendly document, and we appreciate all the comments and questions so that we can help iron those out and bring it back to you in a completed draft form. So with that, Genevieve, if you want to go from there.
Great. Thank you so much, Darren. I'm going to share my screen and just make sure that everyone can see it. Can you see the screen?
We can.
Yes.
Great. Thank you so much, and thanks again for having me back tonight. We have kind of a lot to go through and hope to get some feedback. We have a few items that we'd like to discuss in a little bit more detail, but of course, everything is open for discussion tonight. So I'd just like to give a little bit of a brief reminder overview of why we're here and what we're doing. We are doing a comprehensive update to the zoning code to really reorganize it, make it more user-friendly, make everything consistent within it. It's been updated in a piecemeal fashion over many, many years. So really trying to take everything, put it back together in a way that is as easy to read as possible and can be used by the public and the commission and staff in a consistent way. So we'll be adding a lot of tables and graphics in addition to making sure that we're up to date with current laws and best practices. So our new zoning code has 9 articles. These are the sections that each piece is allocated within. And there's kind of a natural order of zoning codes, the way they tend to be organized. And so we're trying to use that kind of natural order in an intuitive and easily searchable way. So we have reviewed a number of sections with you in the past. We went through at least portions of Article 1, and this is kind of what sets up the zoning code structure. We went through Article 2, and this is the code administration and permits. So we looked at, conditional use permits, and we talked about site plans and development plans and a potentially new development plan and site plan modification process. So that was all done through Article 2. Article 3, this was one of actually the first things we looked at. We looked at the allowable use table and related land use definitions associated with that. We looked in Article 4 at the objective design standards applicable for multifamily and mixed use residential development. We've looked at that a couple of times. Article 5, this was our special regulations. This might have been our last meeting. It has ADUs in it and a variety of things that are kind of unique uses. Those live in this. Adult uses, ADUs, 2-unit developments, those types of unique uses live in this Article 5. Article 6 is standards for specific types of land uses that are just kind of more generic. Those live in Article 6. And we reviewed that with you in conjunction with that allowable use table because they link to the different use types. We reviewed last time with you the nonconformities section, looking at how nonconforming uses, nonconforming structures, and even nonconforming parking would be dealt with into the future. And we looked a little bit at Article 9 in terms of the land use definitions. We still have some general definitions to bring forward to you as well. So today, we'd like to really dig into the rest of Article 4. And these are the regulations and standards that apply to all zones, all zoning districts throughout the city. So Article 3 is going to be where each development standards for each individual zone live. But Article 4 is where those regulations apply across all the different zoning districts. So the structure of Article 4, we've got a number of different chapters in here, and I'd like to go through each one of those with you tonight. And Darcy laid out a lot of these in the staff report that you have as well. And we tried to show really specifically what the changes are in in these sections based on what is in the current code and what would be proposed in the future. So I'd like to go through each one of those except for objective design standards, which we've already looked at with you. So starting with chapter 21.41, this will be the rules of measurement, and this is a new chapter. It's really intended to provide clarity for the user, be it staff or commissioner or the public. And you might recall back when we looked at the land use table, we were really detailed about what the definition of the land use was as it related to the land use table and making a direct connection between that. And this chapter is a little bit similar in that way, in that we're trying to provide the clarity in how each regulation should be measured. And so really providing that, that additional detail that when you think about it, it may seem straightforward sometimes, but it could be interpreted in different ways. And so we want to lay that out for everybody really clearly in this section. So I'll go through just a couple of these sections that have some more unique characteristics to them, but generally this section, it's one of my favorite sections because I think it really does provide a lot of the certainty that people are looking for when they are looking to develop. So in addition to kind of being more specific about how things are measured, we're also proposing in this section to add a little bit more guidance for the Development Review Committee in their review of certain exceptions. So as you know, the Development Review Committee in the current code, there's a lot of allowances for the DRC can make an exception to this particular standard without a lot of kind of clarity on what that exception really means. So this is an endeavor to try and provide a little bit more of that specificity so that it's easier for the Development Review Committee and the public to know what those parameters really are. So here, the current code talks about allowances for the different types of structures to go a little bit higher than the height limit in any particular zone. But it doesn't really say about how high it can be or what it really means. So the new code would provide a process for these exceptions, specifically through a site plan modification, which that was covered back in Article 2. And that site plan modification had some clear findings. And so in this section, we also proposed to add some of those parameters for those exceptions, like how high should they actually be, how that these exceptions should be, or other specifics like how much coverage should that that particular item take on a roof. For example, mechanical equipment, setting that back and having some of those parameters. And a lot of these things are actually included, I think, in conditions of approval, but here we can codify and make it really clear for applicants at the front end of the process instead of later on. In addition, the reorganization of the code update also consolidates all the different ways that density was explained in the various parts of the code, and makes for one consistent way of measuring. In addition, there's one kind of key change to this section as well. In the past, staff had established an interpretation for assisted living facilities to determine their density, since this type of land use doesn't really lend itself to the traditional way density is explained in terms of units per acre. And so the interpretation has been to kind of translate what units per acre mean into beds per acre, so that applicants understand what they're allowed to do earlier on. So the proposed changes would codify this existing interpretation that staff has been using for many years, and this would establish a limit based on beds per acre for this type of land use. For setbacks, similar to height, certain parts of buildings are allowed to encroach into the required setback, that area between the property line and the building, that a building has to be set back. So we've created a new table that kind of outlines what these general allowances are. And that's included in the packet with the information for you tonight. Two things I wanted to point out in this section that are a bit of a change to the current code. The first is with regard to patio covers and covered porches. So in single family zones, the rear setback's generally 20 feet. And attached patio covers are considered part of the main building, and so they aren't allowed to encroach into that 20-foot setback. Whereas the rules for detached accessory structures would allow a detached patio structure to be located even up to 3 feet from the property line. So there's a little bit of a disconnect between just functionality and the way that the code is written for essentially the same structure located attached to a building versus setback from the building. So this is an attempt to kind of mediate that a little bit and to allow those patio covers to encroach 10 feet into the rear setback, actually to 10 feet within the property, from the property line, which is also 10 feet into the setback, actually. And lot coverage requirements would still apply. In addition, uncovered porches and stoops, those types of things, were not really mentioned before. So we've added that into the list of the table that includes all the allowed setbacks and encroachments to allow an uncovered porch to encroach 6 feet into the front setback or 2 feet on a side or rear setback. The next chapter in this article is chapter 21.42, accessory structures. And detached accessory structures have a lot of regulations, actually. But this section in Article 4 is fairly short. And that's because most of the specific regulations for detached accessory structures have historically been based on zoning district. And as such, those get covered in Article 3, which we'll be covering with you next month. So that's scheduled for March 26th. We'll be looking at all of those regulations in Article 3. And I suspect that this section will also come back to kind of jive with that next month when we talk about accessory structures by zone. One subset of accessory structures that melds between attached and detached are awnings, canopies, and patio covers. And we have some preliminary ideas in this draft that we wanted to discuss with you based on direction that staff has heard over time from the public and the commission. This component is still very much a work in progress, likely to be revisited in conjunction with detached accessory structures next month. But I was hoping to start the conversation and to get some feedback from the commission tonight, some direction on these particular uses, so that can help inform how the detached accessory structure piece is also formulated. So to start, we have some new definitions for awnings, canopies, and patio covers. Let's start with the patio cover. The new definition would define these as solid structures, so not made with fabric at all. These have a solid roof structure, and they can either be attached or detached from the primary structure. And these, if they're detached, they're located within 1 foot of the structure. So the reason for this is that staff has seen multiple applications where attaching a patio cover to the building is not structurally preferred or even possible in some cases. So applicants want to construct a patio with 4 posts instead of attaching it to the building, but that wouldn't have been allowed for these patio covers because of the way that the current code was written. So that's a small change there. In contrast, awnings and canopies are made of a flexible material. So an awning is one of those flexible material structures that's attached to a structure. And a canopy can be attached to a building or partially attached or fully detached. But the difference is that a canopy is supported by posts or some other structure that's in the ground, be it a tree or something else. And these can be small canopies if they're less than 120 square feet, or larger canopies as well. So here's a couple of examples of what we mean when we say awnings. The one on the left being an awning, the ones on the right with posts. These are what we're defining as canopies for this part of the code. So the proposed revisions, as mentioned, would treat those patio covers that are detached by no more than 1 foot just the same as an attached patio cover, so allowing for that similar type of treatment. And in addition, here's especially where we'd like to start the conversation with the commission to get some more direction. With regard to patio covers and canopies, what should the city really be looking at to add standards on with regard to what each property can have? So currently the code is silent, but this is a common code enforcement complaint. So adding some text and parameters provides some clarity for code enforcement. Some of that clarity we'd like to add to clarify that these would count towards maximum allowed lot coverage, and clarify where they can be on a lot or where they're prohibited, for instance, prohibited in the front yard or a street side yard, or if on a driveway in front of the building. And there's also a discussion item here for the Planning Commission as well about limiting these detached and attached patio covers and canopies to a total number of 3, or perhaps another number. But we'd like to discuss with you, one, does it make sense to add this limit, the threshold? And does it make sense to have certain additional thresholds by which it would go to a DRC approval? For instance, maybe 1 canopy is fine at staff level, but you'd like DRC to see it if there's 2 or 3. Could more than 3 be allowed with a site plan modification? So if it pleases the commission and the chair, I'd like to pause here and have a little bit of discussion about this particular item.
Of course.
I guess
Mr.
I'd
Marlowe?
be curious of, you're talking about a limit on how many they're allowed on the property within the code. Could you give an example of, like, you said this is a code enforcement complaint. What, example would there be where someone had 3 or more than 3, and what was the complaint, and what would be the disadvantages? No, obviously if someone has 20 canopies, that's a little ridiculous, but at the same time, where would that fall into, an issue with the zoning code?
I can help with that.
Go ahead, Darren.
So from time to time, we see these come up. I know that you can go to Costco and get a carport. You can go to Walmart and people use easy ups for different things. And generally, the current zoning code doesn't really address them. It doesn't require a building permit. It's not considered permanent. But we definitely have cases where they're placed in areas, whether in front driveways or front yards, side yards, and we get complaints from neighbors about what it looks like, which rightfully so. They're not that great to look at, especially if they're up longer than temporary. So I think this is an attempt to do that. I know Mr. Cooper is in our audience here, who has a neighbor who has these types of canopies in the rear yard. And that is very unsightly for his backyard. And he has been patiently awaiting discussing this with you. And so before we get too far along, it would be great to have Mr. Cooper kind of give us and probably, answer some of your questions about complaints and how many, that kind of thing. But in general, I think with the Planning Commission, I think one of the things to discuss is, once we do get in the zoning code and we're trying to regulate these, I think we really need to think about how we would regulate it, and then the ability for the staff to actually then be required to go out and enforce them. There's a lot of things that happen out there that may be unsightly, that the city's codes doesn't address, that, getting involved, and then, we could get complaints and spend a lot of staff time and effort trying to regulate what someone might think is not very sightly. People do a lot of things in their rear yards. I think if we could see in people's rear yards, there's all kinds of things we would think could be questionable. And we don't want to be in a position where we're trying to look and see what people have in their backyards. So it may be something that if it's above fence height, if it's visible from a public way. So that's just kind of the kind of the ins and outs of looking at something like this and putting it in, because this, as Genevieve said, is a new section. And I would just question how enforcement would be handled on these temporary types of structures. And where do we go? What is and what isn't? Is it easy up one of these, or is it not? Just kind of my thoughts on this section.
Yeah, and that answers the question for sure, because I've seen some, carports set on the side of a house that are very nicely done, and I think would be, but I've also seen ones that aren't. So I kind of echo your thought on where would that line be? And I was just curious to, some examples of that. So I understand, and I think for now I'd like to hear what everyone else has to say and listen in. So thanks.
Commissioner Covarrubias.
It's interesting, when I was reading this earlier today as well, one of the things that I do think, me personally, that I see a lot of are these car canopy type detached, like you said, Darren, easy to buy at Lowe's or Costco. They use them for boats, cars. Full disclosure, actually thought about buying one myself about a year ago for my boat. Didn't do that, so I went ahead and stored it at a storage facility. But I guess the biggest challenge, when I was reading this, there's nothing in here that talks about, maybe this is a question for you, Genevieve, about size of property. Because we have so many different sizes of property here in Paso Robles. Should there be a limitation on, okay, is it 2 canopies for X size of property? Is it 3 canopies for X size of property? Is it 1 for X? I mean, that was one of the things that came to mind is, okay, if you start putting limitations on it and then somebody comes to you and says, well, wait a minute, I've got 1.5 acres. Mm-hmm. I got 2 acres. I've got a canopy in the back where nobody can see it. There's 3 of them, but they're hard to see. But yeah, my neighbor's complaining because my neighbor and I haven't gotten along for years, mm-hmm. Right? So, I mean, are we opening up a bigger can of worms, I guess, is my concern. I agree that something should be in place. But again, the second thought I had was, well, what's the enforceability of all this? Especially for ones that have had canopies or these types of things for years. All of a sudden, we're going to get inundated with phone calls at the city saying, hey, my neighbor, or my neighbor down the street, or somebody called on me, so now I'm calling on somebody else.
Right.
I don't know what the answer is, but again, just some thought. I didn't read anything in here about size of property, and I don't know if that's something that should be tangible or not.
And I'll let Genevieve comment, but the thought I would have is primarily, as we think about, our neighborhoods and our, community areas, is one of the first questions is, do you allow them in the front setback, side setback? Do you allow them between, and this is really no matter what size you have, do you allow them between, if you have a house and you have a fence line, let's just say the fence lines go either way, do you allow them where they can be seen outside of that fence line, or do we say that they can be in the backyard, and then get into how many can you have? I think the real one question would be, can you have one in your driveway? Because that's we do see them there, and that would be one thing we could take a look at. Would we side or front or side yard would be a question. And if you're going to have them in your backyard, is that reasonable? Is it reasonable only if it can't be seen? And who's going to determine if they can't be seen or not? That's then are you going to need to, if these don't require a permit, then how are we going to determine whether they meet this criteria or not? So then does that mean these require a permit? And then we've got another list of permits that we need to look and issue and review. So we just need to think about that. But to answer your question, I think we need to kind of take a look down at a site and take a look at where would seem reasonable and where wouldn't, and that might give us a start.
Commissioner Christensen?
Okay. So I hear a lot of what Darren's saying, because a lot of that's rolling through my mind, not only the questions, but I feel like we could get really far into the weeds on this type of topic. The west side here, for example, where I live, very different than some of the neighborhoods on the east side that have CCNRs and have other types of regulations, and maybe not some of the older neighborhoods. One thing you said to me, where you said out loud, Darren, which kind of triggered making sense. I wouldn't want to begrudge somebody. I wouldn't want to begrudge you for covering your boat if you wanted to do that in your yard, especially your backyard. Keeping it out of the setback, that's maybe a starting point to have structures like that, because we kind of do that already when you're looking at a setback on a property and their yard, and we're talking about it for porches and coverings. And I could get the sense that makes a lot of sense. I feel like when we start delving into the backyard and to coverings, maybe do we throw umbrellas in here? Do umbrellas get put in here now? Because I've got several umbrellas. I cover my citrus with it in the wintertime. So I might get into trouble with that, So anyway, I feel having a specific number, I would fully agree with Commissioner Covarrubias. I don't know how we define that number, because the first thing I thought of was there's properties up on, say Walnut and some of those areas up there that are on an acre. And do we begrudge them not to have several large, covers? Maybe they used other parts of the property. So I feel that we could really get into the weeds, and I think we have to be careful with that. On top of the fact that I would think it would create a real problem for the city and dictating some type of enforcement. But I have to say, I think one thing that Darren did say really struck out at me is the setbacks might be a starting point, at least in the front of a house, and the way that that's dictated. If you drive around the west side, and I'm sure many of you have, a lot of those properties, they either don't have garages or they have a garage. It's small. And so you'll see some of those over there. I can see where if there's a bunch of these in somebody's front lawn, somebody would have an issue. Some of it also dictates where you decide to live. So I think we've got to be real careful on how far we go into dictating the number, where they're located. And I think we could go crazy with this, but I think it's, in my opinion, it would not be fair and it would be unnecessary to get too detailed.
Commissioner Davis?
One question that I have is how do you separate this discussion with a canopy or a structure or a patio cover, some of which are there to cover an automobile? How do you separate that from parking restrictions where people are parking an RV out front and maybe don't have a porch or canopy, but just a campus cover over it? How do we separate that? And can they park in the front or not park in the front and store their vehicles, RV vehicles? How do we separate that from the structural? I don't know, Genevieve, maybe you can help me. I see you nodding. How do we separate that debate?
There is actually another part of the code right now that talks specifically about RV structures and where they can, RV canopies, where they can be located. It requires a CUP if you're locating it in a setback. There's a very nuanced part of the code, which we'll be bringing back with Article 3. So yes, again, this one's, they're interwoven. And I think the more that we hear from you today about kind of where you'd like that to go and then bring it back to you next month with those pieces, I think would be really helpful.
Then one quick point. A lot of the west side is in the Uptown Town Center plan, which is not part of what we're talking about tonight. So it would be the Uptown Town Center specific plan is the zoning code really for that specific plan. Once you get beyond like Vine and different areas, then the zoning code would apply. And I'd have to defer maybe to Katie for areas of the Uptown Town Center, such as this type of thing. If it weren't addressed there, would it then pop over to the zoning code? Would be a question. So.
Well, because my understanding was this was all zoning districts, so that's why I was thinking that it would fall under that. So you're saying it does not?
Well, the zoning code is dealing with properties outside of the specific plan areas. So
Great. Okay.
I think that's something that we need to.
I mean, there's still areas you could drive up 12th Street and I could find, it
won't take long to get to where this applies. But
that's a very valid point, though. Yeah. I see what you're saying. Absolutely.
Commissioner Conley?
I think that whatever we do should be objective, and I like the idea of maybe limiting some of these type of structures in the front yard where it's visible. Beauty is in the eye of the beholder, and so we don't know. Some people might like the one awning that's stretched and has 4 posts as opposed to a boat that has a boat awning that has several feet to it. So however we enforce it, we should enforce it equally. If someone complains about this ugly structure, what about the one they're not complaining about that's down the street? So my concern is that we'll only enforce this if we have complaints. We really need to, if we have an objective standard that says this is the standard, then we enforce it to everyone. And to me, the more visual it is, the more important it is to enforce that. If it's visible from the front yard.
Great. Commissioner Kogler.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm not sure that what's on the screen right now is too far from what seems, from my perspective, to be reasonable. The number, I think, is debatable, and whether there's a sliding scale that you start with one number that's permissible and you have a DRC for others, I think is an interesting concept. I don't know how that quite fits yet, but worth consideration. Commissioner Covarrubias' comment about size of yards, I think, is certainly germane, particularly for backyard areas. The thing that I live on the east side, and the thing that I've probably heard more than anything from neighbors was the illustration you had of the car sitting, or the SUV sitting under that canopy. There's one in my neighborhood that's in front of a house on a driveway, and I get more negative comments about that than anything else. And the explanation is the code doesn't cover that right now, doesn't satisfy too many people. So my thoughts are that the standard you just set up there, it precludes this kind of thing from the front yard, and certain side yards on a corner lot, for example, is reasonable and consistent with what I'm hearing from the community. So I would certainly support that. I think there's some distance to go on this in terms of fleshing out all of this works. I agree with Commissioner Connolly. We need to come up with something that's reasonable and enforceable. I will not shy away from something that makes sense based on how enforceable it is. We will strive to do that. But I'm struck by the fact that we have things like feather banners in our sign ordinance that are absolutely precluded, and I can find many of those around the city right now. But again, if somebody complains, there's a tool to deal with it, and I think that could be the case here as well. So that's the direction I would head. Thank you.
Commissioner Covarrubias.
Just one more quick thought, because I totally get setbacks. Genevieve, question for you. How difficult would it be to put a size restriction? Because canopies in particular come in all kinds of different sizes. And we didn't even broach that because we have height limits for other structures, we have width limits, we have certainly setbacks. But do we even dare to try to put some kind of restriction on size?
Well, I think this will come up again when we talk about the detached accessory structures. So right now, there's a limitation on detached accessory structures that you have to be half the size of the primary structure. And so that's been the existing limitation on that piece. And so I think there can be a discussion when we get there about what does that mean cumulatively, for one thing, and then how these would be fit within it. I think that it's a good question. And one of the ways to get to that is also to make sure that it counts toward lot coverage. So you're getting towards that. If it's a 50% lot coverage, you're also constraining it that way in size. But it's so hard to know what someone will be using for a canopy if they're building in a big outdoor kitchen and what the spaces are. So we didn't start with the size thinking we could try and constrain it from these other mechanisms, but open to suggestions on that as well.
It's interesting. I started thinking about tarps. I see in the summer, especially, people will start hanging tarps from the roof lines out to different poles in their yards and, trying to create shade. And I get it. So canopies to me is very different than tarps. To me, something like that, if it's temporary, a one-day event, okay, not a big deal. But if it's permanent, to me, that could be, I can understand the eyesore that could create. So I think, again, some of the challenges we have, to me, a big difference between a tarp hanging up versus a canopy. Bigger difference is the awnings. I personally don't have a problem with people having nice awnings, especially in their backyard. Unsightful ones in the front, not a big fan, but certainly in the backyard, if they're done well and they're done right, they look very nice. They can be flattering and accomplish what usually the objective is, which is to create some kind of shade. So again, I think that's the challenge that we're going to have is how do we structure this so that it's fair, so that neighbors and residences in certain areas are happy, those with larger properties are happy, and then how does the city enforce it? That's always the challenge. So those are my thoughts.
So, Mr. Chair,
Yes,
I'd recommend we open up for public comment at some point here.
of course. Absolutely. Commissioner Marlowe.
Yeah, just one last thing from limiting it to the front yard. If you go back to that slide with the photo, I mean, we can all agree the carport with the dome isn't very pretty, but the one above that is incredibly tasteful, and I think that looks really nice. So how do you delineate between the types of canopies, right? Like, I think the one up top, I wouldn't mind sitting at my neighborhood. I think it's very well done. It's professionally done. And the one below, yeah, I could see how people wouldn't want to stare at that. So do you have a section within the section about the type of canopy that it is? So anyway, just something else to think about, because I think, some of them might fit what we're trying to do, and some of them, we want to limit on some sort of way. So just something else to think about.
Commissioner Davis.
Yeah, I just think we might, I look forward to you opening up to some public comment, especially the height that Mr. Cooper might be seeing in his backyard. I think that's something we should talk about. I don't think I'd want to see something terribly high that I'd look at as a neighbor. So I'd like to hear those comments.
Yeah, I mean, I think I agree that the front yard is of a concern to me, but the limit on 3 also, I mean, if you were doing shade sales in your backyard, you could very quickly go to 3, and then do you really need to go to DRC for that sort of thing? So that's the dilemma I'm in, but I'm pretty confident that I wouldn't mind it not having them in the front yard. But now we'll open it to public comment. Anybody in the audience? Please come up and state your name.
Good evening. I'm Daryl Cooper. I live at 515 Grand Canyon. I have been dealing with an issue for a house that's down below me on Red River. I live up on Grand Canyon, and there's about 4 houses there that look into this backyard. And the individual there, I think he's running some sort of a business. I don't know. But there are 5 what's determined to be temporary structures. Started out with 1, like a canopy. Then eventually it evolved into putting sides on it, but it was a much larger canopy than that. And then they put up a store-bought a little aluminum shed, 10 by 10, something like that, which is fine. But at this point, like I say, there's a total of 5 of these things. They have frames with tarps over them. There's a big string through there with camouflage tarp strung on it through the trees and over this. And at one point, the building department came out there and they made them take off approximately 10 feet. At that time, they said it was too large for a temporary structure, so they took 10 feet off of it, but then they built another one next to it. And now, in addition to these original 3, the occupant there now has built a raised patio deck. It's about 30 inches off the ground. It's heavily constructed out of wood, and it's up. I would just estimate it's somewhere between 15 and maybe 20 feet. And then he erected another temporary frame structure and put tarps over it, and then he built another one next to it, and it's got siding on it, and they've got plastic roofing over it, and they have electricity in there. They're using it for one building as a gym. And I don't know what they do in the others, but this is a dramatic eyesore for our 4 houses that are above. Now, you can't really see the bulk of this from the street, because even that lot is probably maybe 8 to 10 feet above street level, and then they've got a fence. So you can't really see that from the front, but it's all to the rear. And this gentleman appears to be some sort of a hoarder. I don't know what he does, but these things are packed full of some sort of construction materials. He has cross fencings out there with old tires stacked up, probably 20 to 30 tires stacked up, and they've got tarps covering those so you can't see those. So, I mean, it's many different areas of, I would call it debris and hazardous waste. It's covered up with tarps, so you can't really identify what it is. Building department's been out there, and they say that they can't really, there's nothing there that they can hang their hat on to make them take anything down. Now, this canopy, to me, that's a temporary structure. Temporary means temporary. Let's determine what temporary is. 6 months, then move on, then build a permanent structure that's inspected and approved and move on. But this has been going on with this individual house that I have for probably 12, 14 years. So Darren's very well aware of it. Mr. Frace is very well aware of it. And I've patiently been getting frustrated without able to do anything about this. Any further questions that I can answer for you?
No, thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you for your time.
Thank you. Please state your name.
Jeff Carr, Paso Robles. Yeah, this was one item that I did mark down that I wanted to speak to. I think it's really important to separate the awnings and patio covers and canopies. I think you've already mentioned that, because of these, I think you're really, all these negatives seem to be focusing on that one on the bottom right more than others. Because even at my home right now that I moved into, I have 3 awnings on the west side of the house to cover 2 windows and a side door, and I have a patio cover in the back. So I'm already over the limit on that home, and that's not a very large home. And I can definitely see many reasons why somebody would have more as far as patio covers or even awnings on a home, much more than 3, easily. Now, the canopies are a different situation. That hadn't really crossed my mind when I was looking at it, reviewing these. So I see that now is maybe a different situation. And those are more temporary. They're temporary looking, though I don't know if they're always used in a temporary way. But I would focus on trying to write the codes to maybe discriminate the problems people are having with those types of structures versus other types of awnings and patio codes. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much.
Dale Guston, I wasn't going to speak on this either, but when I was a practicing attorney, I often was called on as the attorney for the Country Club Estates to enforce the CC&R. And of course, those are more restrictive than your codes. They did not allow any vehicles to be permanently parked on property that can be seen from the street. So if they had a big RV, they had to put a big fence up to hide it, and even if it was in the side yard. Where I live now, we had structures in the summer, such as in the upper right-hand corner of that picture. But and I understand why they can be unsightly, because the winds in either any of those temporary structures, the winds we get here are just play havoc with those things. And so we've actually put in permanent structures on our property for patio covers, and they're metal, and they suffice. So I agree that you've got to figure out how long you can leave a temporary structure up and see if you can't put some kind of restriction on that. Our city has had zoning ordinances on temporary signs, but nobody enforces them. I've seen signs up for years that are temporary. I think we need to think about enforcing anything that is under the code that's temporary, because pretty soon they become unsightly.
Thank you very much. Anybody else? Anybody online, Marcy?
No callers.
Great. Any further comments from the commission? Genevieve, does that give you some general direction?
I think it does, and we can revisit this one again next month when we talk about RV structures as well as detached accessory structures that are not necessarily a patio cover.
Great.
Thank you. Okay, then moving on to fences and hedges. This next section consolidates regulations that were previously kind of scattered throughout the code, and we do have a few minor changes that we wanted to run past you tonight. First, with regard to front yard fences. Right now, the DRC, Development Review Committee, can look at a front yard fence height modification from the standard, which is 3 feet, to an additional allowance of 4 feet in residential zoning districts. The way that the current draft is written, this would be retained, but we have that new site plan modification process that we discussed a few months ago in Article 2 that would have more findings and more clarity. So that's really the same process, just with a little bit of tightening there. But a couple of new changes as well would be with regard to the review authority for both front yards and some rear and side yards. So right now for front yard exceptions in non-residential zoning districts, these are in the current code under the purview of the Planning Commission, but these generally haven't been too contentious. So it's proposed to change that process to have it go to the DRC instead to review those modifications of fence height up to 6 feet in non-residential zones. And again, we've got those findings to support DRC in making those determinations, and also added some additional language in there about decorative materials and basically making it clear that we're not talking about chain link fencing and what that means. So trying to tighten that up for DRC to make that determination there. Another change would be kind of in the opposite direction, to elevate what's currently at the DRC level up to the planning commission level. And that's to increase fence height from a 6-foot height to an 8-foot height. And that is it's a pretty tall fence. And this is only in the rear and side yards, but sometimes that will happen where it does, where it is visible if a rear and side yard is visible from the public right of way in certain configurations. So this would, instead of going to DRC, go to Planning Commission to address these types of requests for a modification. And that would be through the development plan modification process, again, with findings. And that's all kind of covered in Article 2. And then finally, the current code allows for that exception from 6 feet to 8 feet along any arterial. So this is in residential and OP zones, along arterials in the city, and if it's adjacent to a commercial or industrial use. And I think that's the 8-foot fence on an arterial can become not desirable and opposed by the community. So that's where we wanted to remove that allowance to go to 8 feet if it's on an arterial, but allow it, if you are adjacent to a commercial or industrial use, to allow that exception to exist and continue. The next chapter is on landscaping and open space. And this section provides a variety of different parameters on landscaping, open space for all projects in all the different zoning districts. A new proposal in this section is to clarify the definition of what we mean when we say we want you to landscape a certain part of your property. And that is to include a live plant requirement, so that landscaping is not just gravel and rocks, and a 30% live plant material requirement is proposed. In addition to that, we've also included a clause that the landscaping requirements can also be subject to that site plan review modification or the development plan modification. So you can modify through that process if it's determined not to be feasible. And so a project would use, if it's a site plan that's being reviewed by DRC, they would use the site plan modification process. If it was a development plan being reviewed by Planning Commission, they would request that development plan modification process. New location and screening requirements are proposed for mechanical screening in all of the zoning districts. Mechanical equipment is proposed to be required to be located behind the front facade of a building and adequately screened. And that's the screenings, whether it's at grade or roof mounted. This section also includes a clause allowing for modifications to these standards if compliance isn't feasible through that site plan modification process. So parking and loading is another topic we wanted to kind of pause on with you and run a few options and questions past as we go through this. And in the staff report, there's a number of different proposed revisions that are shown in the table that was provided of where there are changes. There's not a huge overhaul kind of philosophical change, but there are a number of individual kind of modifications that we wanted to go through with you. So we took a look at all the parking and loading regulations and edited them to really be more clear and consistent between the proposed land uses and the way that our land use definitions are listed. In addition, the proposed draft includes some language to clarify when a use changes over or is expanded, or if an addition is added to the building, when do additional parking requirements trigger? And so in the draft, we've proposed that new parking requirements or additional parking requirements would be triggered if that change, either be a change of use or an addition, would cause an increase of 20% or more in the number of required spaces. And right now the code is silent on this, and it's something that's kind of up to interpretation. This section also is trying to provide a little bit more clarity about standards that are linked to bedrooms. So for multifamily, where we have a certain number of spaces for a 2-bedroom unit versus a 1-bedroom unit, we've clarified that if it looks like a bedroom and it seems like a bedroom, it should be counted as a bedroom. There's also a few modifications to parking ratios, the number of spaces required for a particular use that we'd like to review with you. So I wanted to kind of go through the parking table that was in your staff report that shows what the existing code has for each use and then what the proposed code would include. And there's a couple items here that we wanted to discuss in a little bit more detail. That multifamily, a couple of options that were presented, and hotels, a couple of options there. But wanted to kind of scroll through this table with you and just point out where any proposed changes are. So for starters, no changes to single family. Multifamily, we have right now the requirements for 1.5 spaces for smaller units, studios and 1-bedrooms, 2 spaces for 2-bedroom units, and then in addition, you have 1 space per 5 units applied across the board. We've got a couple of options that I'm going to pause on until we have a scenario kind of laid out showing what that means. So I want to skip over that one and come back to it. With regard to caretaker units, current, for instance, supportive and transitional housing has to be treated the same. So we want to just kind of clearly say that that use is treated the same as a residential use in this parking code. With regard to general residential care or assisted living in general, we have a new standard proposed, and staff went out and looked at Creston Village and the Oaks to see what the amount of parked cars was based on the number of residents. And this proposal for 1 space for every 5 beds translated from that on-site research. With regard to commercial and service uses, no changes are proposed. Also, no changes for assembly or restaurants. We have some options to think about hotels a little bit differently. And that scenario, I'll skip over this one so that we can go over that one in detail as well. No changes proposed to RV parks, bed and breakfast, gas stations, car washes. Now, car washes and auto repair, we do have a couple of changes proposed. Current code talks about 3 per automotive service bay, and we'd like to propose a more clear ratio. The automotive service bay, the current code kind of talks about what that square footage means, but it doesn't talk about areas that would be used for the lobby and the office. So we want to be clear about what we mean, and this proposal kind of translates to what the code pretty much currently would be trying to get at, which we found to be about 4 per thousand, but just an easier way of calculating without kind of having to work around it. No proposed changes for warehousing or self-storage, for wine storage, but with regard to self-storage, and this commission has noted in the past that self-storage is kind of the one use that you've seen way overparked from what it needs. So we're proposing a different standard here that would reduce that requirement so that self-storage doesn't also have to provide a lot of parking that goes unused. No changes proposed to manufacturing or wineries. So I wanted to pause with a little bit of a discussion about multifamily and hotel uses. So with regard to multifamily, we wanted to talk to the commission and see what your direction was on providing for any potential reduction in multifamily parking in general, or kind of modifications to the existing standards. So currently, this scenario lays out how many parking spaces would be required for a 100-unit development. This assumes a 51-bedroom units and 52-bedroom units. So under the current conditions, 50 of those units would require 100 spaces. Those 52 bedrooms would each require 2 spaces. The 50 studio 1-bedroom units would require 75 total spaces at 1.5 per unit. The code would also require 20 units for a total of 195 spaces for that development. And so we wanted to talk with you about what you thought about some different options for multifamily residential. And so one is thinking about the potential for fractional density, and thinking about that fractional density has 600 square foot threshold where density units are calculated differently. And so that seemed like a good threshold to also consider with regard to parking ratios. So the 2-bedroom units would all have the same number of spaces in this scenario, another 100 units there. But if a project had smaller units, for instance, under 600 square feet for those studio and 1-bedrooms, they would provide only 1 space per unit. If they were larger, they would provide that 1.5 space. So this then has kind of on the low side, if all of those units were really small, less than 600 square feet, they would still provide their guest parking for a total of 170 units. If they had a combination of unit sizes, they may end up somewhere more in the middle, like 185. If they had large units, it would be just like the existing code with 195 spaces. Another potential option for consideration is to look at removing the guest parking requirement and having 1 space per studio or 1 bedroom and 2 spaces per 2 or more bedrooms. And that would result in 150. And of course, some of these can there's option like 2B or 3A that could combine these as well. But wanted to discuss this piece with you. And then thinking about the hotel scenario as well. We played out a scenario for a 100-room hotel that also has some restaurant and conference room space. So currently the code requires 1 space per hotel room and 1 space per employee on the maximum shift. And then any accessory uses that are open to the public, like a restaurant or a conference room, that then you take the restaurant standard and reduce it by 30% and apply that to, and add that to the other required spaces. So that is the current code. And right now, so a 100-room hotel would have, sorry, the headings are wrong here, but the 100-room hotel would have 100 spaces for the hotel rooms, and then the accessory uses would relate another 31.5 spaces, and then the staffing spaces would be maybe 3 to 5 for a total of 135 to 137 total parking spaces. The issue is that the number of spaces per employee is kind of hard to gauge. We're trying to get away from regulating by number of employees because that fluctuates. It's hard to track. It's hard to prove. So we're looking for other methods by which we would create these parking standards. So one is to kind of just remove that 1 space per employee because we may just hear that, we only have 1 employee at our largest shift or whatever that is. So that's just removing that from the equation. Another would be to throw another kind of section in to kind of get back to where the code intended to be of maybe it's a 1 employee space for every 10 rooms, or maybe that ratio changes in some way. But just kind of thinking about how to remove that employee parameter from the discussion. So I'd like to pause there and get some feedback from you on both of these items for multifamily and what your direction and thoughts are on parking ratios for these 2 uses.
And I just wanted to make a quick comment. My name's Katie Bannister. I'm an associate planner for the city. So there is no requirement for the Planning Commission to reduce multifamily parking. We do the state has a density program where often the city has to give concessions and often the developers ask for a parking reduction. So these are up there for consideration, but we may not want to reduce parking requirements for multifamily. I will say option 3 tracks with what we do in the Uptown Town Center specific plan, so it would simplify a little bit if we were to go with that option, but just wanted to put that in context, that there's no requirement for us to reduce this parking.
Great, thank you. Commissioner Covarrubias.
So I guess I'll start. Parking has been a big sore for me since the beginning, since I've been on this thing, only because, in my personal opinion, I think we push too many people out into the streets. I think our streets are too inundated with people not able to either park where they live, park where they visit, and so they end up on our streets. So with that said, I'll start with the multifamily. My simple mind says 1 space per studio or 1 bedroom, 2 spaces per for 2 or more, and then the only part I have an issue with that is the no guest parking requirement. I think because so many developers, I am pro-growth, I love the development going on in our city, but as a developer, I understand they're looking for every advantage they can get to cut costs, to reduce wherever they can reduce, and it always seems like parking is the one area that is more often than not where they want to find a reduction. So how do we do this, Genevieve, without taking guest parking into consideration in most of our, especially our new developments? I just don't know how we do that, because the reality is, where are they going to park, right? Everybody, the majority of people have guests, family, other family, guest friends. Where do they park? And so I think at the development stage is where you have to implement tighter rules for creating ample parking so that we don't have people pushing out to our streets. So I like option 3. The only part I don't like is the no guest parking requirement aspect of it. As far as the hotels, in my time here, one of the things that we seem to discuss quite often is, again, developers looking for opportunities to cut costs and reduce parking. I personally find it interesting how, we've got a brand new hotel and we're only going to need 4 full-time people to run it. It blows my mind every time that happens, right? We got a 75 room hotel, and you know what? We're going to run it with 3 people. And so, because of that, we qualify for a reduction in parking. I just don't see how that is feasible. So to me, whatever calculation we come up with, I would say we err on the side of caution and create more parking spaces than less parking. So when I look at the different options, I believe when it comes to hotels, you have to, and I get what you're saying. It's tough to take the employee equation into consideration because it seems to be different for everybody. But I like the idea. Maybe it is 1 employee per 10 rooms. Easy math, easy calculation, takes all the discussion out. You know what? The part that will always be discussed will be, well, how many employees is it going to take to run your facility? And I don't know how you implement that. I'll stop there.
Thank you. Commissioner Conley?
Yeah, I agree with Commissioner Covarrubias about having an objective standard with regard to the number of employees on a hotel parking option. I think that's a good idea as far as having it being more objective is based on the number of rooms rather than the number of employees, so that you can count rooms, but you can't always count employees. So as far as the multifamily units, there is some discussion in the attachment about the type of surface, and I was a little confused about that. I assume we're talking about asphalt or concrete. So that's my only concern there. And I agree, too, that I prefer the options that keep the guest parking because of the off-street parking situation or on-street parking where they want to get to where they want to go. They can't park there, so they're on the street. And that becomes a problem. So I agree with Covarrubias on that as well. I do have a question with regard to all of these. I think there are multifamily residents that have ADUs built into them. Do the ADUs count towards this calculation of bedrooms, or is that one of those sacred cows that you can't count it? So,
Yeah, ADUs are regulated separately through state ADU law and are not generally required to provide the parking associated with them. But to your point about the porous pavement,
yeah,
and I might ask,
I didn't
staff,
understand that.
So that's a current, that's something that's currently in the code that says you could do one space per studio or one bedroom if you provide parking that is porous. And I assume that would mean that it is pervious and made of special material for, to penetrate. But I defer to staff on that. My understanding is that isn't really a known part of the code or often used, if at all.
My guess,
Go ahead.
Darren, you could confirm, my guess is that was put in as an enticement for folks to do better stormwater management, and so it is not a part of the code that is used frequently.
So it's like pavers that have openings in them that allows for water to percolate. It's not like decomposed granite or some type of gravel material as opposed to that.
Right.
Yeah.
There's specific language on the types of paving that are allowed. So pervious asphalt could be used, pavers. There's a product called gravel pave, and there's another that's grass pave. Like there's ways you can do it, but it wouldn't be DG. No.
Okay.
And the proposal would be to remove that kind of nuance that seems unused from the code and make it more simple for the calculations. Could I ask just for clarification on the Commissioner Kogler, I heard that you prefer the options that would keep guest parking. Did I hear a preference for option 1, 2, or 3 with regard to the ratios for spaces?
I believe it was Commissioner Covarrubias.
Oh, I'm sorry. Was it?
And I think he did say option 3 with guest parking.
Okay. Thank you.
Commissioner Kogler.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. The easy one, Genevieve, is option 3 with the guest parking requirement is not something I could support. We've seen with Vigneto and some of the other new developments that have come before us that their site design is very tight. Some of them have ADUs that we can't take into consideration, and it becomes a practical aspect of where does anybody's guest park, because the driveways are full. Some cases, there's not even street parking adjacent to some of the units, so I think that's an important component of this. Your option 2, to me, is of some interest here with this sliding scale. It has a relationship to other aspects of the code with the 600 square foot number being pegged, and that one seems pretty workable to me. I would like to overall compliment you on putting together these charts. This really makes these very easy to look at with specific examples, and I think that's well done. On the hotel side of this, I share Commissioner Covarrubias' frustrations that the ones we reviewed seemingly are short on parking, but that seems to happen principally downtown. I don't know that at a project like Ava, and I won't pick on that one for obvious reasons, versus the Marriott that's coming up out of the ground quickly now along Vine Street Frontage Road. Seems like those are a bit apples and oranges in terms of what those sites can achieve. So I think there's a balance we have to find here, but I do believe some reference to accommodating the employees, whether it's 1 per 10 rooms or whatever it is a more appropriate way than the shift thing, because we do question that every time and do scratch our heads on the low numbers that are constantly put forward for that. So that's my initial thoughts.
Commissioner Marlowe.
I'll make this pretty easy. I think option 2 for multifamily is a good one. Honestly, keeping option 1 is the most parking as far as what the graph for the homes are. Keeping it the way it is, the way you're going to get the most parking. But if you're going to make a change, I think option 2 is reasonable. Keeps it the same unless they're a little bit smaller units, and then you just reduce it by 1. I think that's pretty reasonable. And then I'm all for option 3 on the hotels. I think that, obviously people are going to say, oh, we're only going to have one employee, we're only going to have two employees. It's not really enforceable. So you provide objective standard. Is it per 10 rooms? I don't know. You got 100 rooms. Are you going to have 10 spots for employees? I'm not sure that's the exact right number, but I think that it's pretty close. I did have a question. I know we're talking about multi and hotel. You did say on single family there's no change, but I'm reading here, existing's 2 per resident and the change is 2 covered per resident. I just wanted to get some clarification on that because that does seem like a change. And I know we're not talking about it, but it seems relevant.
So existing.
Yes.
The existing code does require for a single family residence in the R1 zone, the 2 parking spaces do have to be covered.
Oh, okay. That doesn't, okay. Just wanted to clarify.
It's just not in the parking table, so we're making it clear in the parking table because it talks about being covered in that part of the zoning and under single family zoning.
Great. Yep, that's all I have. I think 2 and 3. I think 2 as is would work for me, and 3 with maybe 10, maybe 15, something in that ballpark. I guess it would all kind of depend, but yeah, I think that's my selections.
Commissioner Davis.
Yeah, I just want some clarification. Genevieve, maybe you can help me. When we're talking about hotel parking, I'm all in favor of having the guest parking calculated in like we were talking about, but I want to make sure that what we're discussing doesn't pertain to downtown with an existing parking program that gets very, very complex. We're talking about other areas in the city, not the downtown core. Am I correct? Okay, I just wanted to clarify that because I can think of a particular example or two, and I just want to make sure that we're on the same page here.
Correct. Yes, this everything that we're talking about really doesn't address the Uptown Town Center, especially with regard to parking. It's really just when the Uptown Town Center is silent or kicks you back to the zoning code. That's when these things kick in, and that's not about these parking standards.
Commissioner Christensen.
Thank you. That was a question I had, so thank you for that question, Commissioner. If we go back to multifamily, I'll start there. I don't have a problem with the existing. In fact, if it were me, I'd prefer to see 1 guest space per 4 units, even less on some of these projects. I think that could make a recommendation on option 2, although I do feel some of, the 100 unit mark on some of these, I think there might be some sliding scale or some consideration for that when you were talking about some of these smaller projects in the sense of, really not maybe needing as many guest spaces or maybe allowing some flexibility in that in some way. I too feel that parking has become a major issue in our city because of the way some of these are being developed, and I get it. Developers are trying to get the most bang for their buck, but it is a concern for me, and I find that some of these larger developments, the nicer they look, it's because if they have nice open parking and availability for their tenants for places to stay. When you cram all these people into small spaces, even a family with 1 child living in a 2-bedroom, which I would be remiss to not admit that we probably don't have, we have a lot of that in this town. And if it's a teenager, they're probably driving, there's a good chance they could be driving a car. Maybe they're older and still at home driving a car. That's 3 vehicles usually in a home. And I feel like we've got to really take account for that in our multifamily planning. And I know we're trying to juggle both sides of that. So I would be okay, I suppose, with option 2. In my opinion, I don't think you can hurt having a good amount of guest spaces, even if the tenants there end up having to use those spaces. I just think it helps most neighborhoods that these places are being built. Jumping over to hotels, I'll make that quick. I agree with my other commissioners in their sense of holding the employee portion of that accountable for spaces. I think we've seen too many projects, and I'm glad you asked the question about the downtown specific plan or uptown specific plan, because I was concerned with that as well. So I would be okay with an option 3. Again, as Commissioner Marlowe pointed out, is it 10 rooms? I don't know. Is it 15? that's something we probably could measure out that would probably help staff really nail some of these down to make that process faster. So that's how I'd review that.
Commissioner Covarrubias.
Hey, Genevieve, this is Commissioner Covarrubias. Just a clarity, explain to me again how for example, hotels that are built with conference rooms, how is the parking equated for that?
So the way that the current code is written, that those uses are taken separately. So a 3,000 square foot restaurant, you would look at how much will we require for a restaurant. We would require 15 spaces for a 3,000 square foot restaurant. We would require 30 spaces for a 3,000 square foot conference room based on our assembly standards. And so then you take that would be a total of 45 spaces, but then you're allowed to reduce that parking requirement by 30%. So that drops your requirement by 30%. So that's why we're multiplying by 0.7 there to drop that down. And then you add that portion to the 100 spaces that would be required for each of the rooms, and plus any additional spaces for the employees. And that's how you get your total.
I know Katie's getting ready to say something.
Just the intent of being able to reduce those number of spaces is because some portion of the people using the conference rooms or the restaurant are going to also be hotel guests. And so that's the reason you can reduce those numbers, is you likely have people using both facilities.
So is that a city thing that we implemented as a...
That's in the current code.
That's in the current code as a benefit to the developer. Interesting enough, I was at in fact, Warren was there, at a chamber retreat at La Bella Serra, and showed up for we were using one of the conference rooms. And when I went to park, every parking stall in La Bella Serra was full. I had to park in a little roundabout area that was there, and that's just one of, I think, 2 or 3 conference rooms they have. So interesting. That's why I think one of the things that is always seems to be, we are pro-growth, which is phenomenal, but we implement a 30% reduction rate that's optional, that's available to them, and I'm trying to understand why. Why did we do that? Why do we do that? Because where are these people going to go? I get the shared employee, guests, all that stuff. We do this stuff, and I think we shoot ourselves in the foot sometimes because we're trying to be so pro-growth and everything, and that's great and attractive to developers, which is fantastic. But at the cost of pushing people out in the streets, there's got to be a balance somewhere.
So while you're on that point, I'm just thinking of something. We could go back and look and see what the parking numbers and ratios were for La Bella Serra. Your comment would be is La Bella Serra needs more parking.
Yes. And we were in one of the conference rooms. The other conference room was not being used.
Mm-hmm. And the project description at the time may not have that small of a room. Sometimes you don't really think of it being
right.
A space for outside people, for people that are not staying there.
Right.
So we can go back and look at that, but that'd be a good example that we can look at before we come back next time.
Thank you.
And I would note that some standards for hotels vary among different codes that I've worked on throughout California. But some, I don't know if I'd say many, but maybe close to half, maybe I'd say, of the codes that I've seen don't even mention those accessory uses and really just rely on one space per room. And those maybe are really underparked. But that is what I have seen in a lot of places as well. And then the other half, I would say, look at those accessory uses and may apply some kind of discount in that as well. But it is not unheard of to have even significantly less than this. So,
Commissioner Davis.
Can I ask?
Oh, yes. Sorry.
So, and just so I can clarify something else in the other section, in the same section, but other topic, under type in land use, when you say major repair, body work, and minor repair in the guidance, is there going to be a distinguish between what is major, what is minor? Just curious on that. There is. Okay.
Yes. Each of these are linked exactly to the land use description that happens in the land use table, and they all have a land use definition associated with them. So it'll be really clear.
Perfect. And on the landscaping part of it, I like the idea of requiring a 30% live plant requirement. My question is, a few years ago, we were in a drought. So if that ever occurs again, how does this all play a part? I saw that there's also a section 4. I know I saw it. I read it. Water efficient landscaping. So is it one of those things? Well, okay, we're in a drought, so we're going to use water efficient landscaping requirements. We're not in a drought now. We're going to require 30%. How is that going to play out?
So the water efficient landscaping is a requirement of the state. There's a model ordinance that that's really directive by the state, and so that's what that section really parallels. I think with regard to the live plant material, that can be drought tolerant, should be drought tolerant, but you can still have drought tolerant landscaping and not have it just be rocks.
And during the drought, I don't think there was the prohibition of planting a yard. There was the prohibition for how much turf, overhead spray irrigation you could plant. But when it got down to drip, and now, the water efficient ordinance and the building codes require all the projects to provide their water calculations and what types of plants and low use of water. So all that is built in beyond the zoning code. But I think that just the reduction of turf alone was more of the issue under that drought situation.
Commissioner Davis.
I'm going back to the residential. Can you go back to the other slide for me, please? Yeah. There was something that Katie said that I'm just still mulling over it. So help me out, Katie. You said we don't have to do anything. We don't have to reduce parking. And I see these scenarios, and I know we're talking about these options, but I have community people talking to me about not enough parking in our residential areas. So I guess the question that I ask is, what motivates these scenarios of reducing the parking requirements? Is the industry standards? Is it constituent or developer complaints? I just know what I hear from the community, and they say we don't have enough parking in our communities.
So
in our neighborhoods.
Yeah, so we had a long list of items that we wanted to kind of a fix-it list for our zoning code, and reducing multifamily parking was on there. And my suspicion is the reason it was there is that we are anticipating the state is likely going to want to see parking. They're already, for certain types of projects, transit-oriented projects, they're already telling cities that you can't enforce your normal parking standards. So I think the intent was to sort of get ahead of that. But as we started creating these scenarios, we started realizing that maybe we don't want to, throw the baby out with the bathwater. And maybe if we're going to give a parking reduction, we should be expecting some affordable units in return, and not just say blanket, you can have reduced parking. We could, we have to allow reduced parking when there's an affordability element, and they comply with the state's density bonus. So that was why I put the preface, was maybe we want to put a pause and see what the state does potentially, or maybe we want to.
I had to ask that. I appreciate you coming up and commenting, because it's this document, unless we come to another change or modification, and start piecemealing it again, it'd be easier to be conservative rather than, try to go back to where we were. So I just toss that out there.
Commissioner Copeland.
Thank you. Since Commissioner Covarrubias opened up landscaping, just one quick comment, Genevieve. I think the 30%, just when I read that, makes some sense that there should be landscaping in front yards. However, a cul-de-sac lot that radiates out from both sides, one oak tree probably could be meeting 30% of that lot area at mature canopy, which is what it does state. So I would just take a close look at that and see if that's really a standard given certain lot configurations that practically works, or whether there's something that needs to be teamed with that will ensure some front yard landscaping in situations where maybe simply one planted tree would cover it.
Commissioner Christensen.
Thank you. I have something totally out of everything we've been discussing, and I found it in my notes. It was just a clarification for you on page 7 of 342 under the the discussion where it talks about the use of an arterial greater road where the driveway might require cars to back out and it's determined to be infeasible. Down there, there's a note, and you talk about the city engineer would help with the feasibility. Is that defined? I guess my concern was when I saw that and I read that, it jumped out as me like, how are we going to define what if the city engineer changes, or what is there some kind of medium that we're going to use for that type of benchmark so that it's not just seeming so arbitrary? Do you know what I'm saying? I know that's a tough one because it's such a small aspect probably, and probably hardly ever will come up, but just using that word seemed a little arbitrary, and I didn't know if we had some kind of way to measure that, or maybe staff has a better way of explaining what the thoughts are on that. So that was it for me.
Great. And then I think I like option 2 for the multifamily and option 3 for the hotel. I think that's pretty much the way to, I feel, to go. But I do have a ever so slight editorial comment on page 45. Essentially, it's a 21.48020B. We typically don't use the word handicapped anymore. So if we could change that to accessible, so maybe accessible parking spaces, and then we would then need to roll down on the general requirements and maybe change that to availability for the heading, and then parking and loading areas shall be available for its intended use, because handicap is not really a term that is preferred anymore. So let's open it up to the public on this parking issue. Anybody like to speak on parking? Seeing none. Great. And yeah, yes, Commissioner.
I'm just curious. Thank you. You added a bullet for parking for electric vehicles. Is there some type of criteria as to the number of parking for electric vehicles?
I think the Green Building Code requires it.
It's just, yes.
So,
sorry, go ahead.
Go ahead, Genevieve. I'm sorry.
Sorry, I skipped ahead to talk about, now I'm really skipping ahead. But I was looking for this one and skipped ahead, but I will talk about the electric vehicles. But yes, it's really just a reflection of what's in the Green Building Code to let people know that that's there.
Okay, thank you.
Commissioner Kogler.
While that's on the table, just a quick question, Genevieve. Is that parking tied to a charger location, or is there other parking requirements for EVs?
It's really just talking about the fact that you have to have the EV parking and the what the Green Building Code says as far as making sure that that they're set up for charging later if you don't put them in now.
So, and just since I get to say, give my opinion, I know this is incredibly difficult, parking standards, and it really raises a lot of concern for a lot of people. But on the flip side, I think we've all seen projects that have been incredibly overparked and the difficulty that that provides. So I appreciate staff working so diligently to provide what is a reasonable parking standard. And if it were up to me, I'd err a little bit on the less parking than the more parking because of what parking does to a neighborhood. So that is my opinion. And back to you, Genevieve.
I wonder if it feels appropriate to you to just do a straw vote on this, because I think I heard more support for 2, maybe 1, but I'm not sure that I have clear direction from the commission on either going with option 1 or option 2.
Sure. I'll just I'll roll down this is for multifamily. I'll start with Commissioner Marlowe.
Option 2.
Commissioner Conley. Commissioner Davis. Commissioner Covarrubias.
1.
Commissioner Kogler.
2.
Commissioner Christensen.
1.
And myself is 2. So I think it's pretty close. So I think it's 4-3. 2. Leaning towards 2.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
And then I think we were unanimous on the hotel. all three.
Yeah, I think so.
Yep.
Great, thank you.
Like I said, parking is difficult.
It's a tricky one. So we have a couple other parking and loading regulations that I'd like to go over. That was the big one that I felt was going to require a lot more discussion, but happy to, if anything comes up that you want to talk about more on any of these, of course, please feel free to interrupt me. On the parking and loading regulations, we have changed a few parts. We talked last time about having an option for reduction and what should that be. There are current standards in the code about how to deal with a mix of uses on a site or multiple uses on a site. We've revised that to match what's done in the Uptown Town Center specific plan so that we're consistent in both documents. It's easier for staff and for the community to understand that, those standard for how we deal with mixed use could to be consistent throughout the community. We talked in the past about this option for the parking study to allow for an additional reduction. So right now the code says there's certain uses that if you get a CUP, you can reduce your parking. And so here we're trying to put a little bit more parameters on that option to say you have to have a parking study done by a traffic engineer, and that parking study can't ever reduce it by more than 20%. And we're not proposing this for residential where we would want to potentially get a density bonus and some affordable units, and it's not applicable to the Uptown Town Center or to hotels. So really kind of constraining that existing option for a CUP to say, here's a process to go through a modification process with a parking study. If you can meet all these standards, if you have a type of use that really is going to be using less parking, we have an option for you to go through that process. And so that is included in the proposed code. And one other component is about home occupation parking. So right now we only allow one parking space, one parked kind of company vehicle as associated with a home occupation. And, I think this was a topic that's come up a few times of home occupations that might have more than one vehicle. And what's the process for that? So we've included some about screening vehicles, and then this would allow a process that you could modify that allowance instead of just having one vehicle, but you could have more than one, even up to 5. And that's kind of a question. Is 5 the right number? Through this site plan modification process, DRC would look at those. And as we discussed, we have some regulations that align with the Green Building Code for electric vehicles. With regard to driveways in particular, the backing up onto an arterial road. So there's a component already in the code, and this would kind of make it so that it's really applies regardless of the zoning district that you're in, but something to this effect already exists. But we did add this kind of allowance for an out if it's determined to be infeasible by the city engineer. So if you cannot create a circular driveway because it just simply doesn't fit on your property, there's a process that would allow so that we can still provide access to an individual property. We have a few other places in the code where we talk about the city engineer determining feasibility, especially with regard to access to the public right-of-way and other things like that. So it's a pretty standard kind of piece of kind of code language that lets us have that flexibility just in the circumstances that it really wouldn't work, but we don't need a person to go through a variance for that. The maximum driveway approach width, right now the code is silent on this, but we would limit that to 30 feet. And then we have some discussion about decomposed granite to make it clear that decomposed granite is not considered a permanent surfacing material and it shouldn't be used for driveways. We do have an allowed exception for single family if they'd like to request it through a site plan modification, and they've put in parameters where they're not dragging gravel into the streets. They've got enough kind of systems in place to make sure that they're not affecting the public streets, that they could go through a site plan modification to use DG or gravel for their driveway. This section of the code also talks about landscaping in parking lots. Right now, the code requires every parking lot that has more than 4 spaces to landscape 8 square feet per space in parking lots. That is proposed to be increased to 6 spaces to allow, it's pretty hard to fit it in on some of the smaller sites. And so that is the reason to increase that one. Similar to the driveway non-permanent parking lot surface material, there's an allowance in the code right now, I believe. Is there allowance in the code? No, this is an interpretation, sorry. There's an interpretation about when this type of non-permanent surface might be okay. And so staff has made some interpretations on existing lots that are quite large, where the parking lot or the parking space is located, further away from the public right of way. You really can't see it. It's been allowed in the past, and so we'd like to provide a process by which these types of modifications could be requested. So with that site plan modification, there's findings. These are only allowed on large lots and located behind the primary structure on the rear half of the lot. With regards to non-residential uses, these would have to go to a planning commission request for a development plan modification and meet certain findings in order to allow that non-permanent parking lot surface.
So Jen,
and then,
can you go back to the last slide? I think the first one that said decomposed granite not allowed for driveways. Exception for single family DG. And then the next one seems to allow it with
so this is,
go ahead.
This is just for a parking space. So just one individual space that's not a driveway. So if they have the driveway is paved, but then they've got a space where they are parking something else, maybe a boat or their car.
I was kind of leaning towards the non-residential portion of it. If I recall, we approved a project on the south side of town that had a DG parking lot. And it would seem that what we say in the thing before excludes it, and now we're allowing it. So I'm not sure I understand.
So one thing that this zoning code update is creating is this type of application you can make for a modification. So the development plan modification is when a developer asks for a special exception. And so in this case, a development plan modification would require the project to go to the planning commission. And there are specific findings that the planning commission would have to make in order to approve this. Anyway, so the standard would still be that you need to use permanent parking lot materials, but you can make this request of the planning commission, which the planning commission can deny if they can't make the findings. And there are things like that it makes for a better project. I don't have the findings in front of me, Genevieve, but they are more expansive than what is there today. And maybe that doesn't answer your question.
Well, I mean, I guess if the limitation reads exactly as it's written on the slide, then do we need to say or with a development plan modification?
Yeah, so the way it's written is that you have to use permanent materials unless you get a development plan modification.
Okay, great, thank you.
But Genevieve, can you go back one slide? Because I was kind of confused on maybe it was the parking space versus the driveway. Because I thought it indicated for single-family residential that they could use non-permanent materials.
With a site plan modification for driveways, yes, single-family could use non-permanent materials. With regard to a parking space that is not the driveway, that would only be allowed if they're on a large lot.
Okay, we can just note these to discuss at staff level a little bit more.
Yeah, so well, I'm just going to muddy the water, but
Join us. Water's fine.
So the first slide is about driveways, and what it's saying is that your driveway has to be a permanent surface. There is this one little exception if you have a single-family residence, if you're willing to go to the DRC and the DRC thinks that it's an appropriate use. On the west side, we've got rear driveways that come off of alleys that aren't paved. Does it make sense to pave your driveway when the alley is a dirt driveway? Maybe not. So maybe the DRC would consider it, on a case-by-case basis. So driveways are going to be not decomposed granite. There's a list of materials. So that's driveways, and everybody except those occasional single-family residences will be doing a paved driveway. Then we look at parking spaces. So parking spaces, we're saying, well, if there's a paved driveway, all of the gravel and stuff could fly off the car before they make it to the public right of way. And if someone really wants to do these alternative parking lot surface materials, it could be considered. It is on a residential project, the DRC could approve it. On a non-residential project, it would go all the way to the Planning Commission, and Planning Commission would have a series of findings. You could put conditions on it. It would be a discretionary approval. So I don't know that I clarified anything, but that is how we intended for those to be.
I actually think you did, so thank you. Okay, Genevieve.
Thank you, Katie. I think the last one here is to allow the use of an RV as a caretaker residence on a seasonal stand, like a pumpkin stand, or on a construction site. Right now it's a CUP. We would change that to a TUP because a temporary use permit instead of a conditional use permit, because we don't want it to run with the land, and it is really a temporary use. So just making that clarification there. Moving on to trash enclosures, this chapter 21.51. There are a couple of new pieces in here that we took kind of what are more design guidelines, either that applied in the industrial and commercial areas, but really kind of tried to codify some of those pieces to make it clear what the requirements are. The first is to look at when an enclosure would be required. The code was silent before, and the intent is to try and, make that more clear. To replace the trash enclosure design guidelines, again, with those standards. One of the pieces was to look at multifamily. In particular, the guidelines in the past said that a trellis above was required. In speaking with the engineering and folks responsible for stormwater, full roofs are recommended for all enclosures, so that has been added to this section. Looking at the material that is used for that enclosure as well was added here, prohibiting chain link as the material if it's, if you can see the trash enclosure from the public right of way, not using chain link for that enclosure. And making sure that enclosure is not located in a front or street side setback. In the past, it's been silent on all setbacks, and so we want to clarify where we would allow trash enclosures to be located.
Hey, Genevieve.
With regard to, yes.
Commissioner,
can I ask you a quick question on that topic real fast, only because something interesting was brought to my attention. At the same chamber retreat I was referring to earlier, one of our board members is one of the owners of Paso Robles Waste, and they were showing me via Google Maps the location of a trash dispenser, a brick little thing. Long story, they couldn't get the truck. They can't get the truck back to the where the trash enclosure is located. So my question is, do we require? I know we always talk about emergency services and we always talk about, do we require waste management group to go out and take a look when where we're putting these trash enclosures and the accessibility to these so that it makes it easy for them? They literally have to get out of their truck, run to the back of the unit, haul the stuff to the front, dump it, haul it back. And they say it's an extreme inconvenience. Anyways, that was just a comment.
So not quite a year ago, the city hired a solid waste manager, and we, at the planning department, has been guilty of not always coordinating with Paso Robles Waste and Recycle in the past. But this new solid waste manager has really helped us to coordinate. And so projects that have come in since, his name is Adam Spalding, came on board with the city, we have done a much better job. And in our opinion, hopefully Paso Waste will agree that we have started routing projects to them sooner so that they can have early feedback.
Go ahead, Commissioner Christensen.
One quick comment too on this particular topic, because I read the portion about require full roofs for all enclosures. You're talking about trash enclosures for multifamily. That seems like to me, that seems a bit stringent. Would we like to exercise that when it makes sense? I probably, but I don't know that, in my opinion, that should be something that's mandated on every project. I feel it's a bit extensive, especially on some of the smaller projects. When you're trying not to attract attention to a trash area, maybe you're trying to keep it, obviously you want to keep it from being seen easily, but I'm not sure a roof really, that just seems a bit over the top on some of these, especially the smaller projects around town. So that'd be
Christensen, as I understand it, that is an additional requirement from Regional Water Quality Control Board and Stormwater Pollution Prevention. I know the city of San Luis requires a covered trash enclosure on all of their developments. So I think that's what they're trying to limit the amount of additional water mixing with the trash and runoff is the intent of that particular.
So it's a state requirement is what you're saying? Or is it a requirement in San Luis Obispo?
I believe it's a requirement of or it's a request of the Regional Water Quality Control Board.
Right.
So it ends up being essentially a state requirement.
And we added it to the.
It would make. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
No, we added it to the draft on the city's stormwater manager requested that we add it. So it's there as their request that it be added.
Okay. So if it's a requirement from the state, then that would make sense. If it's a recommendation, I still think you should allow for some flexibility on that in certain situations.
So we'll clarify whether it's a requirement or if it's a best practice, so everybody knows where the discretion is for the city.
Dale Augustin, I kind of did a take on the full roofs over them too. Centennial Park doesn't have them on their traffic closures. So I understand now if it's a state requirement, I guess we have no choice.
Then one quick comment. Genevieve, can we go back to where trash enclosures can't be located on a site? So it's a prohibit enclosure in front in street side setback. My thought on that would be if a project's going up to the planning commission, obviously we don't want them in the front and side setbacks, but if we're dealing with a commercial zone that may have zero setbacks or something that's a tight site, kind of like Rob was alluding to, if they can't put it in the front or site and the only place is at the back, but then it can't be accessed, it just seems to me that through a development plan, we might find a situation. It might have to be incorporated into the building somehow so that it's not just sitting out there alone, but I would just mark that as further discussion.
Got it. All right. Moving on to signs then. So the signs section was pretty comprehensively updated to reorganize it. And one of the key things was looking at it to remove any content-based standards. So that's consistent with best practices that were led by a Supreme Court case, Reed versus the town of Gilbert. And this case has led to updates throughout the country to really try to take out any regulations in a sign code that would require you to read the sign in order to regulate it. So really no content-based standards, really looking at the time, place, and manner. Those pieces of a sign code are really defensible to regulate, but really trying to clear out those content-based portions of the code. So that was kind of one of the big overhauls to this part of the code. As part of the reorganization as well, certain parts are proposed to be moved to other parts of the code. So the zoning code is really intended to deal with property and what happens on property and not what happens in the public right-of-way. So those signs that are really in the public right-of-way are proposed to be moved to other parts of the code, specifically Title 19, I believe it's 19, which deals with billboards, and Title 11, which deals with street furniture and everything else that's kind of happening and any signs that are in that public right-of-way space. In addition, as part of the kind of reorganization, we consolidated some sign types to avoid some redundancy. Generally, new pole signs aren't allowed except for certain large centers and highway-oriented signs. So we've consolidated monument signs under freestanding signs because the standards were really all the same. And then finally, the current code references a sign program. So a sign program is the mechanism that kind of unifies all of the signs within a development or a multi-tenant center. And while the code currently references that sign program, it doesn't really explain when you would need a sign program. It's just that sign programs are, sometimes exist and this is what you do with them. So the proposed draft would set that threshold for when a sign program would come into play and be required. And that would be for multi-tenant centers that have 5 or more tenants. New clarifications are also included throughout this section of the code. One is about how signs are measured. The code was kind of generally silent on this piece before. So the draft includes a process and lots of really good graphic examples about how you would measure signs using 8 corners with 90-degree angles to get to that sign area. Rather than, in the example in the picture, rather than being one large rectangle, allowing for more interesting signs through this type of calculation. Another proposed change is to revise the threshold for which a second taller freestanding sign would be allowed. Currently, the code only allows these additional tall freestanding signs on sites that are 20 acres or more. And looking at a variety of different properties in town and kind of different conditions, staff was recommending reducing that down to 10 acres. And then finally, currently, if you have a non-conforming sign, the code would say if a new business comes in and they want to just change out the copy on that sign, they would instead have to basically take down the sign and make it conforming before putting up the sign. This would allow a change of copy on a non-conforming sign through the design review process, rather than taking the entire sign down and having to replace it. The sign code would also include a process for modification. So when you can't comply with the code, again, these different ways that those modifications can be requested are outlined here. So the kind of 3 different ways that these requests for modifications exist are through the site plan modification at the DRC level, the development plan modification at the planning commission level, and a special plan development at city council level. And so the modifications kind of generally range from kind of minor under site planning modifications through, kind of middle in development plan modifications, and then up to special plan development. So within the site plan modification, what the development review committee would look at would be, a modification to where signs are located, sign area height requirements in the Uptown Town Center specific plan, where there's a measurement of letter height that always seems to come into kind of a problem. So, and there's no process to easily modify that. They could do that through the site plan modification process. Under a development plan modification, an applicant could request to modify the allowed number of signs or the configuration, or especially under highway-oriented signs, some modifications about sign height or sign area in particular. But if an applicant really just wanted to have a bigger sign, that would go up to the city council level as a special plan development. and also sign height to exceed the maximum allowable sign height. So really just kind of setting a structure for these type of requests and who the responsible review authority would be for those. Did you want me to stop there for any comments or questions on signs?
One question. Yeah, Commissioner Covarrubias, please.
Okay, got it.
Sorry. Thank you, Chair. Genevieve, just a question. We put a lot of emphasis on height of sign, width of sign, illumination, and all that's great. My question is, I recall a project we had here in Paso where an applicant literally wanted to, it appeared, they wanted a sign on every part of the building, every side of the building, multiples. Is there anything in the code that addresses the amount of signage you can put on any given facility? Am I missing that?
We have listed under, so each type of sign has its own, has a specific sign area amount limitation. So you are limited by your lineal foot of frontage to your building mounted signs and your monument signs. So those are all, they all have a limitation to them. And it's largely based on the lineal frontage of a building or a property. So there is a standard that you're constrained to the total area. And then within that area, you could either put it on as a regular wall sign or a projecting sign or those other types of signs, but they all have to fit within that kind of bucket of area.
Okay. Okay, thank you. Let me think about this.
Commissioner Davis.
Genevieve, just a question. I think I heard you say that this new recommendation here, large sites, threshold reduced from 20 acres to 10 acres, does mesh with kind of the highway corridor signage that we've had in the past. I mean, you mentioned highway signs, but we have a highway corridor. Help me out. What's it called? I know we've dealt with that several times in the past.
These are actually two different pieces. There is the highway oriented signs section, and then there is another section that allows for one larger sign on large sites that are not located on the highway oriented sign corridor, and that's mapped on the zoning map on the two highways.
So the zoning code recommendation doesn't change or alter in any way the highway corridor practices?
I'm trying to think, Katie, if we had any specific changes.
There are some changes, but they don't, it doesn't really change like the height or the area. There's some grammatical and organizational changes that are made to it, but the highway-oriented sign process is still the same. It comes to, it only allowed in the specific overlay zone, and then needs a CUP for any highway-oriented.
And the height, like the big highway signs, that would come, it doesn't.
Right, so currently there are, the way it's very, the highway-oriented sign, like many parts of the code, is very confusing, and it lays out different standards for different sort of, like, I think the highway-oriented overlay was expanded over time, and different standards were put in different areas of town, and it's very hard to track. So there are some standards put in there to try to standardize it and to say, you know, in this, like, to make it clearer without having to dig into old city council resolutions what the standards are. Because there's actually currently, if you want to know what a highway-oriented sign can be allowed on Highway 46 East, you have to go and find a 1986 city council resolution. So there's some new language in there, but they're not really new standards. It's clarifications for the highway-oriented signs.
So the only reason I'm asking is we wouldn't want to see a whole lot of really tall signs pop up with any zoning code amendments.
No, and in fact, that large sign where you have to have 10 acres, that's actually meant to catch, like at the Albertson Center, there's several small 6-foot tall signs for like Taco Bell and the gas station, and I think Wendy's has one. And then the whole center has a taller sign that says, you know, Albertsons and whatever else. And so that allows that one taller sign. And the Albertson Center is actually the reason we lowered the threshold to 10 acres, because it does not meet the 20-acre standard. But it seems very logical for them to have one larger sign. Across the street, you've got Walmart with one large sign that announces the center. It's, you know, in a big center, it makes sense to have that one larger, because otherwise the maximum height is 6 feet for a freestanding sign.
Right. Okay. Thank you. I appreciate it.
Great. Anybody would like to speak on signs? Not seeing any. Genevieve?
Great. Cruising right through. The last couple of sections are pretty minor. Swimming pools, these are really clarifications here. We wanted to clarify the setback for pools is to be 10 feet from the primary building. The code was a little bit unclear before that or silent. There's one modification. Pool fence height is regulated by the building code to be 5 feet, but the zoning code had 6 feet. So we're proposing to make it consistent with the building code and make it 5 feet, but add a materials requirement that wasn't there before. Building does not want the fabric mesh kind of removable types of fences, so we're looking for a real fence that is 5 feet tall here. So really aligning with what people are going to hear from the building department and getting them that information up front in the zoning code. And then finally, undergrounding utilities. This is a clarification consistent with an existing general plan land use policy. The undergrounding of utilities was kind of scattered in the code before. It wasn't really clear where it applied, but the general plan policy was clear to require utility undergrounding in all zoning districts.
And I wanted to make clear that the way it's drafted is that new service drops. It's not necessarily undergrounding the distribution lines. This is new service drops would be undergrounded. That's how it's drafted.
Any questions, comments from commission? Anything from audience? That's nothing. Go ahead.
And then just kind of, thank you. Just cruising through these last two then, adding a new chapter on visibility at intersections, referencing the city's engineering standards. And then this water efficient landscaping section is largely existing code, just edited a little bit to remove some of the unused language. But again, this is a state required component of the zoning code. And that covers all of the different chapters in Article 4.
Great. I think we've had great discussions. I think Commissioner Conley would like to make a comment.
We kind of flew by fencing and walls, and I have, I guess, a question with regard to page 40 of 342. If you have a side yard where you, the way I read the fencing restrictions is that's a 3-foot maximum. Is that for the frontage of the roadway within the public right-of-way, or would that apply to the property line that would be part of the owner's backyard? Because it would seem like that if you look at that on page 40 of 342, you look at that dashed line, there's actually 2 dashed lines there, and I didn't know if it applied to both of them. Where it says the side yard 3-foot maximum fencing height, it would seem like the property owner would have a concern with privacy in their backyard if they couldn't have a 6-foot high fence.
Oh, thank you. The intent there is for it to be a street side yard, not an interior side yard. So that is on a corner lot. The two, the front yard and the street side. It's just kind of like their other front. So I think that the hyphenation on that is problematic, and I'll double check that.
And then I have another question with regard to fencing. Well, maybe it's more of a comment. With regard to removing the allowance for a residential or office professional to have an 8-foot high fence along an arterial, does that apply to residential areas as well?
Yes. So a residential property, if their rear yard backed up, they're allowed to have a 6-foot fence, but would not be allowed to go to 8 feet, which has the potential to feel a bit tall and could be contentious to the neighbors too.
Well, from a property owner's point of view, they might think that it would be more inviting for an intruder to hop the fence and get into their backyard. I'm just was wondering if you do that, you'll see people attach fences to their to the permanent fence. They'll attach these temporary 2-foot high things, cantilevered above the wall. And so it's just something to think about there. We skipped over that without discussion, so I wanted to get my 2 cents in on that one.
Appreciate it.
Commissioner Kogler.
Yeah, Genevieve, I'd like you just, when you go back and look at this, to consider also 21.48.040 item E2, which deals with additional parking for home occupation. I think we're looking at trying to get some more definitive enforceable standards this time around with home occupations, and the chair made a comment earlier that parking is perceived as being a problem in neighborhoods. Having 5 spaces seems excessive to me. I don't know if you indicated it's 4 right now, but 4 seems a bit excessive as well. And I would just like to think about that in light of item B, which says that it can't change the character of the property. I think parking has great ability to change the character of a residential neighborhood, so I would like a review of that, please. Thank you.
Mr. Guston.
Dale Guston, in the book I looked at back there, on page 6, I saw a reference to the downtown paid parking, but I didn't see it come up on the screen.
Do you have a comment regarding the downtown paid
Yes,
parking?
I do.
How about
in 2018, I attended a forum up in Pleasanton, and at that forum, Pleasanton showed how they used time parking to solve their downtown parking problem, and it worked. And no paid parking. So then Julie Dixon came to town, and she said, well, I have a better program, but it involves paid parking. And so I went to all her seminars, and I argued against it, asking for time parking. But the city said, well, she said with 5 days a week, Monday through Friday, ending at 6 o'clock, it would be self-sustaining. Well, it wasn't. And so the merchants thought they could live with that. But then Julie Dixon said, well, we got to change it. We got to make it 7 days a week and last till 8 o'clock at night, which, as we've now determined, has alienated the locals and has hurt a lot of the local businesses. We did a lot of surveys after that change, and that change showed that over 90% of the residents and the businesses does not like the paid parking. So the city council is going to bring it back on the 20th, but there's this concept that it should pay for itself. Well, it may pay for itself and it may not. 76% of the revenue is fines, $50 fines. That also alienated the locals. I mean, you can't go out at nighttime at 8 o'clock and even see the signs. So I don't know how the Planning Commission has had any input on that, but I'm telling you, I just can't see how we can continue with this paid parking program and not hurt our city and its citizens immensely. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Any other comments on parking or anything else that we discussed this evening? Commissioner Kogler.
Chair, I think it should be stated for the record that the zoning ordinance does not deal with paid parking.
Correct.
That's a totally separate issue. Thank you.
Thank you for that. Anything else? Anything else for you? I guess that wraps it up for this evening. Oh, yes, sir. Please. Please join up and state your name, please.
Jeff Carr, Paso Robles. What confused me today was the KSBY story that was announcing this meeting. Darren was involved in that. And it was talking about City of Paso Robles is updating its zoning code by upgrading its technology. And then it went on to say that we're getting into the modern era of internet. And this was supposed to be about doing things by the website rather than opening up a large book. Well, to be honest with you, the only access I've had to zoning is through the website and through the Muni Code and through the specific plan. So if there's a big book, tell me where to find it, and it's different than what's online, because I've never seen it, and I want to make sure I'm seeing everything. So that was very confusing to me, and I guess it's also wondering, is the ultimate end for this document back in the Muni Code? And that will ultimately be the range of the navigation that's available and such, because it's never really been discussed. There's probably a lot more, better capabilities than that website. But I know the documents we're getting to review, the drafts, are all just very flat PDFs. There's no hyperlinks, there's nothing. So they're often very hard to navigate through when I'm trying to review things. They don't tell me anything about what's changed necessarily. There's usually another page for that. There's no, even some of the changes, if I had missed a meeting, I probably won't know why it was changed. There's one point on that specifically on Article 4. There was Table 21.41-2 was talking about max densities for R2 and R3 zones, where I really would have nice to have a footnote there on where those came from, because they are quite a bit different from the previous zoning, where they were all based on slopes. And now there's like a top level where it doesn't matter what the slope is, there's a top level density. So I'm really trying to, if somebody could get back to me on where those numbers came from, that would help me understand them better. So I guess ultimately then we are talking about, it is going into the Muni Code. That's the only thing I understand. It's going to be happening. And I did have some other questions about, for instance, Article 2, home occupations. And I'll throw them out here, and maybe I can get an answer at another time. And mainly in the definitions, I know that you mentioned that they had added some and they had removed some, but I don't know which ones were added or removed. And I'm kind of trying to understand why some were included and some were not. There were some that I thought might have been fine, and then other communities do use them. And also there was an issue with some of the definitions. They mentioned like automotive repair, and I'm not sure, that's a pretty broad term. And I think there's some subsets of automotive repair that I think should possibly be considered that, don't involve bringing cars in and dismantling things. They just might be one part of the automobile that's being sent in to be worked on. For instance, I can send out like fuel injectors for a motorcycle. I can send them to somebody who's got a home occupation. They clean them up, they test them, they send them back. And it's a probably easy operation. So I was trying to figure out what those definitions were. I mean, I'll go back and check terms and definitions again. I missed that in Article 9, but I'm not sure they're there. There at least should have been a link.
If you could wrap up your comments.
That's it. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much.
Dale Guston, I had one other thought. Commissioner Davis indicated that there's might be some ambiguities about freeway signs. I actually had one of my first clients was McDonald's. McDonald's first located where the Carl's Jr. is now located. And they were going to make them put their sign way back on the building at the back of that lot where it wouldn't be seen from the freeway. So they hired me to get a pole sign. Well, then the issue of height came up. And there were service stations way down there at 24th Street that were 50 feet above the level of the freeway. So that's how I got the pole sign 50 feet above the level of the freeway for McDonald's, which is now being used by Carl's Jr. Anyway, just a little note for how I got involved.
Thank you.
Anyway, you did a good job tonight. I appreciate listening to all of it.
Great, thank you. And with that, I think we'll wrap up this evening on the zoning ordinance update for Article 4 and move on to, thank you, Genevieve, very much for your presentation.
Yes, thank you.
Thank
And
you.
staff. Thank you.
Thank you.
And with that, we'll move to the consent calendar. We're looking at the October 10th Planning Commission meetings, November 14th Planning Commission meetings, 28th and December 12th Planning Commission meetings. Does anybody have any comments, or is there a motion? Commissioner Kogler.
Motion? I would move approval of the consent calendar, including the 4 minutes that are shown.
I would second it.
First by Kogler, seconded by Conley. And with that, can I have a roll call vote, please?
Commissioner Kogler?
Aye.
Connolly?
Aye.
Commissioner Marlowe?
Aye.
Commissioner Davis?
Aye.
Commissioner Christensen?
Aye.
Commissioner Covarrubias?
Aye.
Chairperson Neal?
Aye.
Motion passes 7-0.
Great, thank you. And then other reports, Paso Robles Ad Hoc Streetscape, or Streetscape Ad Hoc Committee, sorry.
Okay.
Its name.
We are looking at, I believe, the first meeting in March, which I believe is March 5th, for a presentation to the City Council. So I think it would be best for the ad hoc members to be there, and then the ad hoc members, along with staff, could present basically the PowerPoint that we presented in August. So I'm hoping that a couple of the ad hoc members would be available for that presentation.
Great, and if you're available, give Warren an email and maybe we can coordinate the presentation. And I don't think we've had a zoning code update report in a very long time. No way. HCOC, are we meeting anytime in the near future?
We don't have any meetings scheduled right now. Those are kind of scheduled on an as-needed basis. I think the zoning code is to a point where it won't go back to HCOC. It's just in the Planning Commission's hands moving forward. But there's probably some affordable rental housing issues coming up in 2024 that will go back to HCOC.
Great. And then the planning DRC schedule, I guess we'll get a new one out here pretty soon, Marcy?
Yeah, I'll get one out soon.
Great. And then,
Mr. Chair?
I think, yes.
Just a quick comment on it, if I may. I expressed this last time. I'm down for March of last year, and if that carries over to March of this year, I do have 2 dates in conflict during the month of March. And so I'll either need somebody to cover, or else if I could get some other month during the year, that would alleviate that problem.
I can make that work.
Okay.
And then I think I think that's it. And I think the rotation may stay the same other than March, because the commission has kept its same makeup. And with that, we'll go to planning commissioner comments, and I'll start with Commissioner Marlowe.
I think it was good information. I appreciate everyone's hard work, and I think it was a productive night.
Commissioner Conley.
And just echo that. Thanks to everyone here.
Commissioner Davis.
Yeah, thanks to staff who've worked hard on this. I appreciate it.
Commissioner Christensen.
Great job by staff. I think that was really helpful with the diagrams that Genevieve provided. I did have, since we're having quick discussion, I had a question for staff. Has there been an update status in regards to the Central Coast Smog and Auto Repair situation? I know it came up in my mind because of the fact that we were approving those minutes, and that was back in November. Has there been any update from that? Or can you guys maybe get us an update for the next meeting?
It's on our list that we go through weekly, and I know Darcy's been working on it and with the city attorney, so they've got some deadlines coming up pretty quick, so I think we're going to reach out to them and remind them.
And the only reason I've been driving by there quite a bit for work, so I was been just very curious on that, so thank you.
I think I've seen some effort towards a retaining wall. I don't know if he's
That's a
actually
careful
pulled the
word.
permit, but it seems to, something's happening behind the fence. Commissioner Kogler.
Thank you. I would just like to congratulate Commissioners Neal and Covarrubias on reappointments. I think it was a great group of people this time around, which was encouraging. But I'm also encouraged to be able to count on working with you, who I really regard highly for the next few years. Thank you.
Commissioner Covarrubias.
Thank you for the comment. Thank you to staff. Good job.
And I don't have any further comments other than I look forward to hanging out with you folks for another 3 years, or at least some of you folks for another 3 years. And with that, do I have a motion to adjourn? And with that, let's call it a night. Thank you so much.
Yeah.